Okay, hope you're all doing well. Looking forward to learning together in person. Karov, very soon, God willing, for the next year. We're on Mem Ches Amud Aleph 48A2, and let's begin. So if you're on the article, it's the second column. Amar Rami Bar Chama, Harav Chisda v'Rabba. This machlokas we've been talking about between Rav Chisda and Rabba about whether or not we say Hoel or not. Rav Chisda said no, Rabba said yes. Machlokas Rav Eliezer Rav Yeshua. It's actually the same disputes of the Tanaim, Rav Eliezer and Rav Yeshua, that we had in the Mishnah, which began this whole conversation, and that is Rav Eliezer holds the principle of Hoel. How do we know who holds the principle of Hoel? Remember, Rav Eliezer and Rav Yeshua were dealing with the following case. They're dealing with a case where there is challah that is tameh. There's bread, rather, that is tameh. There's dough that is tameh. Okay, and you're trying to make it into matzah. If I go ahead and we pose all these challenges, if I go ahead and I mafresh the challah before, it gets very problematic. So Rabbi Eliezer's solution was that you go ahead, you bake them all, and you separate the challah afterwards. Okay, now when you separate the challah afterwards, what are you going to do? You're ultimately going to take one roll out of all the rolls and use that as being challah for all the rolls. Now, that's really problematic, because that means that when one of the rolls that you baked was actually a roll that didn't really have any purpose on Yom Tiv, and as we spoke about earlier, you can't really do something which doesn't have a purpose on Yom Tiv, since again the Kohen can't eat the tamei roll. So why does Rabbi Eliezer allow you to bake all the rolls if one of the rolls that I put in should not have been able to be put in, the one that I'm ultimately using for challah? So we explained the reason Rabbi Eliezer says it's all permitted is Hoel, since I'm theoretically able to go ahead and break off a portion of each and every roll. Okay, I could do that. I don't want to do that, because then I'd have a bunch of half rolls or 3/4 rolls or 4/5 rolls. That's not cool. So I would not do that. But theoretically, I could do that. And since I could do that, therefore, I'm allowed to bake them all, even though later on I'm going to take one roll from all the rolls and use that as challah. Okay, Rav Yeshua holds I don't apply the principle of sins, and therefore he doesn't accept this rule. He doesn't accept that you could do this. Okay, Amar Papa. Rav Papa rejects this. He says, he says, Rav Papa pushes back. He says, who says? Maybe Eliezer does hold of Hoel, but in a much more limited sense. Maybe he applies the principle only in that case. Why? Because the time the loaves are put into the oven, each and every one of them is fit for the baker himself, right? Each time the person's putting in a roll, each one of those is fit for the person. The person putting them in is able to eat each one. Okay. But the case that Rabba was talking about was a case where I'm putting food in the oven. It's way too much food for me. It's at the end of the day. It's the afternoon. I already ate. It's way too much food for me. I'm putting in a why. What's the principle of Hoel? Since theoretically guests may come, then it's going to be okay. That's a much bigger leap in the principle of Hoel, and therefore the Gemara says that maybe Rabbi Eliezer does not hold of Hoel to the same degree that Rabba does. And similarly, the Gemara is going to point out that maybe Rabbi Yeshua does not necessarily not hold of Hoel the same way Rav Chisda doesn't hold of Hoel. Okay, so meaning Amrav Shisha Parade Rav Iti the Demlohi I'd kind of look Rav Yeshua Hasam to Lomin Hoel Ella Dika Chad Lo Chazile Lo Dizay Lo Archin. Okay, that Rav Yeshua holds, maybe Rav Yeshua only says over there we don't say Hoel. Maybe Rav Yeshua says we don't say Hoel by the challah. Why? Because Dika Chad Lo Chazile Lo Dizay Lo Archin. There is one roll, one loaf that's ultimately going to be designated as challah, and it's not going to be fit for the person nor for visitors. But here in the case where a person's baking for after Yom Tiv, maybe he would say Hoel, right? So maybe Rabbi Yeshua, who in the Mishnah says he rejects the notion of Hoel, he says I'm not saying this principle of sins, and therefore he doesn't allow the person to go ahead and do Rav Eliezer said and bake them all right now because of the principle of sins. But maybe in a situation where that's because at the end of the day there's going to be one thing here which is not fit for anyone. But in the case of baking on Yom Tiv, on the theoretical possibility of guests coming, that's a case where there is an actual application, an actual potential usage of the bread, and therefore bottom line is we point out that these two machloksim do not necessarily link up. Amrua Rabbana Kamed Rabbi Yirmiyah Rav Zera. Okay, so the rabbis said this idea that linking up Rabbi Eliezer and Yeshua to the dispute of Rabba and Rav Chisda, and Rabbi Yirmiyah Kibla, Rav Zera Lekib. Rav Yirmiyah accepted it, Rav Zera didn't accept it. Amrle Rav Yirmiyah Rav Zera. Rav Yirmiyah says to Rav Zera, Milz de Kashilan Ba'asin Kamashnei. We were struggling for many years. My plea of Ezra Yeshua, trying to understand what was going on in the Mishnah. Why was Rabbi Eliezer and Yeshua? What are they arguing about? Okay, we didn't really understand. And Hashemura Mishmei Gabarabba, and now we have an explanation. Said in the name of Rami Barchama, Velonik Kabla, we shouldn't accept it. Okay, so Rav Yirmiyah is saying we never understood what they were arguing about. Now we finally have a solution. Why are you rejecting that they're arguing about Hoel? So Amrle, Rav Zera responds, Hey Chiyakale, how could I accept it? Because it's going to show there's a brisa which seems to contradict this principle, this linkage. The Tanina was taught in the following brisa. Amrle Rav Yeshua. Rav Yeshua said, Lidvarecha hari over mishum lo sasa kamalacha. According to your opinion that you are allowed to, that you're going to bake all the loaves on Yom Tiv, you're going to actually be in violation of not doing any malacha. And Rav Eliezer was silent. Okay, now that means Rabbi Eliezer did not have a proper response. The fact that the brisa leaves off and doesn't have Rabbi Eliezer responding, that means he didn't have a good answer. Now, if it's so that Rabbi Eliezer held, the reason he held that you let to bake all the loaves because of the principle of sins, he should have said, the reason I think you're not in violation of the Saskim Malach is because I hold the principle of sins. Amrlei. Rav says that's not a proof. The fact that the brisa leaves him off as silence, according to your reasoning, let's look at the following. We learned in a brisa the following. Amrlo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yeshua, according to your words, over Mishum Bal Yirav Elimatze. Right? So Rabbi Eliezer turns to Rabbi Yeshua and says, according to you, that we're leaving the challah over. Remember, according to Rabbi Yeshua said, separate the challah, and you're not over on Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh. Rabbi Eliezer says, according to your approach, you're going to be in violation of Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh, v'shasikle. And that brisa doesn't have Rabbi Yeshua responding. Hachinami delo hadule. You want to tell me Rabbi Yeshua did not respond? Hakam hadule masnisan. It's not. We know he responded because in our Mishnah he's recorded as having an answer. Lo zeh chamash b'shem harna love b'shem Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh. We have Rabbi Yeshua saying explicitly, responding to that question, saying that no, he holds that Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh is only that the violation of owning, seeing chametz is only when you own chametz or someone else owns chametz. But when it comes to challah, it's which isn't really owned by anyone, and therefore you're not in violation at all. The point is that he's pointing out that you have another brisa where there's no response, and yet we know he does respond elsewhere, right? So elashastik leba brisa masisan. So what's the point? The point is that Yeshua was silent in the brisa, and the brisa doesn't record his answer. But in the Mishnah, we do have an answer. Hachinami here too. Emar shastik lemasnisan v'hadulem mechilta achriti. You can tell Rabbi Eliezer was silent before him in that brisa. Responded to him in another set of brises, even though we don't necessarily have it. Okay, now the Gemara is going to talk about what is the halacha. Tanya, we're starting the brisa. Rabbi Yomer halacha Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi says the halacha is Rabbi Eliezer that again, what do? You bake them all and you separate one loaf afterwards. Rabbi Yitzchak Amar halacha ben Besera. He holds halacha is like Ben Besera said. You put it in cold water that prevents it from leavening. V'chamashir isa. Okay, now the brisa continues and goes on, talks about something else. What is the maximum amount of dough that you're allowed to knead on Pesach? In other words, if you have a small amount of dough, you could easily prevent it from becoming chametz. If you have a huge amount of dough, then at some point it's going to be too hard. Even if you're working the dough, it's going to be too hard to keep it all moving in motion, and therefore some of it's going to become chametz. So Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshel Yochanan ben Broko Omer bechitim kavin. In the case of dough made of wheat flour, it's 2 kavin. It's measurements. Uvis orange shlosh kavin, and when it comes to barley, it is 3 kavin. It's the opposite. Okay, Tanya. We asked the Gemara. There's a contradiction. It's taught another brayso. Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan ben Broko Omer bechitim shlosh kavin v'is orange 4 kavin. Here you have in the case of wheat flour, the maximum is 3, and in the case of barley, it is 4. Okay. The brisa before we had the same Tana, Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, who said it's 2 kavin of wheat and 3 of barley, and here it's up 1. Lokasha, the Gemara says no contradiction. Ha bechasi chasa. The brisa, the second one, deals with poor grain. Okay, and poor grain is actually it doesn't leaven as quickly. Ha b'mal our brisa is talking about a case where there is superior grain, and therefore it gets. Hope you can hear me. There's superior grain, and therefore it leavens quicker, and that's why the measurements are smaller. Amar Papa Shmamina, you could see from our these 2 brisas and the way we reconcile them. Girin agrin chite chasi chasa mechite mal yasa tfe mi de gri and saare chasi chasa misare mal yasa. Okay, poor wheat in relation to good wheat is more inferior than poor barley is in relation to good barley. Dilo hasan tilsa. Regarding the wheat, the difference between the 2 qualities is 1/3. V'hacha riva. When it comes to barley, the difference is only 1/4. What he means is as follows, right? In the brisa, right, the contradiction was when it comes to wheat, one brisa said 3, okay, and one brisa said 2. So there's a third of a jump. When it comes to the barley, it was one brisa said 3, and the other said 4. So you see the difference between good and bad of wheat is 1/3, and the difference between good and bad when it comes to barley is 1/4. Okay, let's stop over here. I look forward to Mr. Shem seeing you soon. 48. We'll pick up on the bottom of Amud Aleph.